All right. Well, welcome to International Leadership Association Leadership Perspectives webinar. I'm your host today, Jay Gary. I'm pleased to have with me a co-host, Dr. Tricia Gott, Associate Professor, Associate Dean of the Staley School of Leadership, Kansas State University, and I'm coming to you from Tulsa, Oklahoma, uh, uh, Program Director, Faculty of the Doctor of Strategic Leadership at Oral Roberts University. It's great to be together. We're looking at the new context of U.S. leadership, retrenchment or reset. And we're proud to have with us three panelists from the Global South speaking to us and speaking to you. If you're a leadership coordinator, faculty, if you're a trainer in industry, whatever, public, private, civic sector, we're talking about building leadership in this time of extraordinary change. So with that, if you haven't already, you're welcome to grab that chat, and you're in listen only mode, but you're a vital part of our conversation through text. So go ahead and put in the status bar in the chat a greeting to fellows, members of International Leadership Association and new friends, where you're coming in from, what your organization is. Everything in chat will not be put on the recording, but we will be monitoring it. And then later, you see in the gray here, we'll have panelists come up and you can direct questions to panelists. So with that, Tricia, tell us what you're looking forward to and where are we going?
Thanks, Jay. So today we're looking forward to the opportunity to hear from some panelists about what we can learn from the global community as they consider their own lessons learned, as they've navigated challenges in their own history and their own past. Sorry, Jay, I'm getting distracted by the chat because what I'm really looking forward to is this incredible group of people here.
Yes.
So we've got people chiming in from Georgia, from Virginia, from New York City, from all over Europe, from all over sub-Saharan Africa. I'm confident we've got colleagues in the room from our East Asia contingent and our Southeast Asia group, as well as Latin America. But I'm also excited here today because the ILA hosting this has some really exciting network opportunities coming up that we want to make sure folks on the call know about. So you're going to hear from three panelists today online, but we also want to make sure you all know what's upcoming with the ILA. So we're looking forward to next, the international conference, which will be hosted in Prague, Czech Republic. So the global conference is October 15 through 18 in Prague. Some of you have already received notice that you've been accepted to present in Prague, and that's a huge congratulations to you, or maybe you have a book project that's being featured. We're looking forward to learning from you and hearing about your work. If you are not part of that group, we hope you'll attend and learn a little bit about what's going on in the international scholar and research community, or join that community to be part of the discussion and enrich the research and the scholarship that's coming out. No matter where in the world you're located, this is a great group of people to join and to start enriching the conversation. And we hope that out of this panel today, that there might be some future work. I know personally for me, we've got a Building Leadership Bridges book that is underway right now that's featuring stories of leadership and practice from sub-Saharan Africa that will come out in 2026. And I anticipate that there will be more scholarship focused on the work happening in sub-Saharan Africa. I think this conference in Prague will be a great way to feature that.
All right. Thank you, Trish. So today, the link to the slides that you'll see that we're sharing about upcoming events and are at the link that's now being put into chat. And then I'm going to just set the stage right now for why are we here and why are we talking about the new context of U.S. leadership. And then we'll have a panel, then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll end before the top of the hour. So why are we here? Well, as the new U.S. administration reshapes domestic and international relationships, how should leadership program coordinators in education or industry, how should we respond to these shifts? So today we're turning to Global South experts to address how to navigate the changing context of U.S. leadership in view of the resurgence of nationalism fueled by economic populism. Now, you're looking here at a political cartoon of President Trump's first 100 days, and here's Uncle Sam trying to hold on while this wild horse is galloping forward as the administration has acted to amass power, to confront the courts, to threaten allies, cut humanitarian aid, deport people without due process, place sweeping tariffs on imported goods, pulled back on military aid to Ukraine in face of Russian aggression. In short, upending a world order that America has made over the last 80 years. So the question facing us, is this a retrenchment or is this a reset in U.S. global leadership? So why are we here? As those charged with advancing the study and the practice of leadership, we're here today to listen to these voices of the global South, to ask ourselves, how should we respond to this new context? Preemptively, proactively, what's our response? So in that case, our aims for today is for you to appreciate how our panelists' context, their local, national, regional, global context shapes their leadership and their leadership programs. Number two, we'd like to learn how those outside the U.S. have dealt with the erosion of democratic norms in favor of centralized control, how they've navigated autocracy and stress test on democracy. And third, we want you to be able to evaluate how ILA's general principles for leadership programs might help us build collaborative leadership capacity of learners. And so speaking of ILA leadership programs and our general principles, they're fivefold: context, which we're talking about today, framework, your leadership framework, your content of leadership learning, and then your outcomes for leadership endeavors. This could be a competency models within your health sector. It could be in technology. It could be in higher education. We're talking about the context of leadership programs, which is many times the base. What do we mean by context? The local context, your organizational, institutional context, your stakeholders. We're talking about your regional context, your national and your global context. Of course, we're speaking of the global context today and how that affects us and how to appropriately respond. And so what you're seeing here is the web page for the Committee to Advance Leadership Programs, and you're welcome to go to that web page and download the general principles for leadership programs. These are the five kind of DNA of international leadership. It's been with us for almost 25 years. First 2009, then 2021. It's been refreshed, and so this webinar is being sponsored by that committee, which generated that and promotes that across ILA, all of our member communities. So you can see our past webinars at that page as well. So let me bring up our guest at this time, our panelists, and a cue to you that you can type not only in comments if to other participants, but you can direct your questions while our panelists are talking in the Q&A, distinct from chat. So with that, let me bring up our panelists and introduce Dr. Emmett Tadesse Wodogis. He's the professor and director of the Ali Marzi Center for Higher Education, University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Second, you see Linda Simeoni. She's chief of staff of TBGA Branding and Communications Agency, Harare, Zimbabwe. She's a Mandela Fellow in 2019, which is a partner program of the ILA, and she's run for public office in Zimbabwe and is an auditor by profession. And then third, Marius Wusenhuizen. He has a PhD in public leadership. He's a foresight expert and facilitator working in a multilateral environment. His work's taken to over 40 countries to address government, business, and civic society executives. So welcome, panelists. Let me take down our slides and chat together as colleagues here about the new context of U.S. leadership. So first, Emmett, let me go to you. What do you see this as? Is this a retrenchment, or is this a reset in global leadership?
Thank you, Jay. I think you raised a very important question. Thank you for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this excellent panel. I think it is very important to put the question in perspective because US has been a very important ally for most African countries for the past, I would say, 40 years since the end of Second World War. US has never been part of the colonial project as compared to Europe. So there is always kind of a positive, in most cases, relationship with most African countries, leading to development cooperation, democratization, and several leadership also initiative. I think under the current administration, we are witnessing a market turn towards retrenchment in the US-Africa relations. We can see key indicators to support this agreement, including, for example, the withdrawal from, or defunding of several multilateral institutions which are critical to African development, such as the World Health Organization, the United Nations Population Fund, both of which support vital health and social programs on the continent. Moreover, we have also seen these administrative drastic cuts to the US aid, particularly in the area of education, gender empowerment, and climate resilience. So there is a clear shift from a multilateral cooperation to sort of transactional bilateral deals, often framed in terms of security or commercial interest rather than long-term development or mutual benefit.
Right. So I hear you saying you're saying retrenchment. All right, let me go to you, Linda. What do you see this in the new context of US? Is this retrenchment or reset?
I see it as a bit of both, but I lean towards a reset more in terms of sometimes when you realize that a relationship, the US-Africa, Global South relationship might not have been working very well. And they were citizens in the country who deserve to be heard. Those that are speaking loudly for nationalism deserve to be heard. And if the relationship ceased to be beneficial for the US, it was about time for a reset that benefits citizens of a nation, because a president's first duty is to their citizens, right? And if citizens are leaning towards a not so palatable, what can I call it? A not so palatable, can't call it move, but a not so palatable frame of doing business with the rest of the world, then in line with democracy, those citizens also deserve to be heard. But what I have faith in is that US institutions are strong enough to course correct when a course correction needs to happen in the future. So I lean towards a reset more.
All right. Marius, over to you. Retrenchment, reset.
Hi, Jay. Great to spend time with these great panelists and friends. I would say that if we don't see a reset, we might see retrenchment. And I'm building on the comments made by Linda and Emmett when I say that. I think that the world that the US led since the Second World War, where the US has become sort of a guarantor of global human rights, it's played a bit of a role as the policeman of the world. It's underpinned the multilateral institutions of the world order, as you said, and the financial system. I think those that influence assumed a certain level of credibility on the part of the US, that the US as a democracy, as a market-based system, has answers to the great questions of our time. And sort of the US, operated from that point of view. I think that assumption may not necessarily hold true, that, in a world of systemic risks, climate change, global inequality, a rising global south, I don't think we can assume that the US necessarily has the answers. And US leadership assumes, of course, that there's a followership on the other side of that transaction. And so, who wants to follow the US, I think, is an important question. And so for the US to continue to lead or provide leadership in the world, I do think it needs a reset around values, around its relationship, particularly with the global south. I think the global south now has a new level of agency that it didn't have in the 1950s and 60s. It wants to use its voice. It wants to be in partnership. We talk of trade rather than aid, for instance. And so I think the US still has a lot to offer the world, and US leadership is still important for the world, but it will need to be a rethink if it's going to have the credibility and the influence that it used to have.
All right. Emmett and Linda, are we out? How do we rethink? And how do we, Marius, and you've been involved with the BRIC nations in advising, and Emmett, you've had interaction. How do we rethink our relationship to South Africa, Emmett? Because right now it may not be on a sustainable course, right? How does the Global South lead in this context, not just follow? Emmett, to you.
Yeah, I think the most important issue that we have to deal with is that the Global South agency is actually growing. And there are a lot of other also constituencies emerging apart from the old ones, including BRICS, for example. So South Africa is building its own networks apart from the US, and China is playing a very important role in this regard. So I think the most important thing is to establish a clear agency of all partners, whether in the US or in South Africa, and clearly discuss agendas so that to have a clear future. Otherwise, the old way of doing things, the linear, it's no longer there. Now we are living in a very serious multilateral world order where agencies are emerging. The power of a lot of emerging economics, including South Africa, countries in Latin America, in Asia, they are really forming a new alliance that actually challenge some of these old so-called superpowers. So I think there is a need to sit around and discuss with these agencies and have kind of a mutual cooperation framework that include the voices of the Global South.
Right. It seems you mentioned superpowers, and there's some leaning toward the new age of great powers dividing up the world, or Yalta 2, right? How do we navigate that? I think let's turn the conversation from this global framework to your context. And I want to hear from each of you, starting with Linda. How have you navigated rising autocracy in your context, whether it's chaos or cruelty, corruption, centralized power? What advice do you give to leadership practitioners, scholars from your experience, in your case, Zimbabwe? Linda?
Thanks, Jay. In the Zimbabwean context, we're still deep in the trenches. We haven't figured a way out. We're still navigating around autocracy, around corruption. And it's how I have navigated. It's a very difficult environment, and how I get by, and in my organization, I lean into my values. My values are my guiding principles when there's just chaos all around me. And also leaning into the networks that I formed with others, having conversations around how are they doing? How have they managed to how have they managed to navigate in their own spaces? Because in most spaces, for example, Dr. Trish, there has been stability in the US. So leaning into networks that have some form of stability helps me keep my bearings right. But mostly I lean into my individual values and also organizational values.
Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Jay.
Morris, over to you. How are institutions navigating this in the multilateral sense versus the unilateral actions? What do you see? What lessons can you give us as leadership practitioners and scholars?
So, Jay, two experiences come to mind. One is a very personal South African experience. If you follow the trajectory of South Africa, you'll know that we had what some in the press have called the 9 wasted years under President Jacob Zuma, which was sort of a time where the country was increasingly moving towards corruption, the hollowing out of state institutions. A key lesson from that experience and the success, I was very privileged to be part of a civil society movement that ultimately removed President Jacob Zuma and saw him replaced through a movement called Save South Africa. But the lesson there was that the voice of civil society has to be constructed. I was in a conversation with a gentleman called Paul Graham, who's very experienced in civil activism, and I was talking to him about the need to mobilize responsible citizenship. And he taught me this principle that, sometimes voices in society need to be constructed. You need to bring the church, the faith communities, the labor unions, the activist communities together to construct a societal voice that can stand for something better than the trajectory we see. And I think then to move to my second point, we see this now in the multilateral space is under the current conditions of conflict, autocratic populism. We see a move away from principled leadership to transactional leadership. And in the process, the calculus around what are we losing from a values and morals and ethical point of view, what are we losing in the process, that gets lost. And I think once again, like we saw in the wake of the Second World War, there's a need for the reconstruction of a societal voice that is committed to principle and willing to painstakingly build the institutions that can stand on principle rather than short-term interests.
Thank you. Emmett, talk to us about how you navigated changing contexts in your situation. You're leading a graduate program in education, right? How has higher education navigated this, and how are you navigating this?
Yeah. I think it was a bit of a challenge at the beginning when we hear all these newses on cutting of funding all over the place, because of course I'm directing a research center which is focused on higher education studies, and we are highly dependent on external fundings, including funding from the US. So this is indeed a time of uncertainty, recalibration, and intensified, geopolitical contestation, where the very idea of leadership, its legitimacy, form, and reach is under constant interrogation. But we try to, acknowledge what is actually happening and diversify our partnership with the rest part of the world, not necessarily with the US, but also in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. We have also been very critical about what's actually happening in the US when it comes to academic freedom. So we have responded to this autocratic drift by proactively, internationalizing our academic network and securing funding from independent and non-state also sources, and leveraging also our institutional platform to robust defend academic freedom. We have also produced and disseminated critical research on authoritarian tendencies in higher education governance, and collaborated with partners both in South Africa and Europe to support scholars at risk and also safeguard, intellectual spaces. And I think In this context, leadership is not merely administrative, at least from my experience. It is also an act of resistance. So, and it requires a binding transitional alliance, amplifying marginalized voices, as Linda said, and reaffirming the role of scholarship in upholding democracy and human rights values. So this is what I have been trying to do and encourage also my team as a response to what is actually happening around us.
All right, thank you. So Marius, constructive conversation, Emmett, resistance. Linda, you're no stranger to calling for accountability in your context. Talk to us about how you've navigated these contexts and what advice would you give to leadership scholars and practitioners for constructive as well as proactive and pre-active responses.
My advice is at times it's okay to admit that we don't have the answers, and the answers are evolving as we live. And let's not stop asking questions. Let's not stop demanding accountability, because if we move from a value-based leadership perspective, we will always ask the right questions. So let's not stop asking questions. Let's not stop demanding accountability. That's my advice.
Okay, all right. And you've been in the public service sector and helping in communications as well as advocacy from various frameworks. And so, as a communications expert, what have you been able to do in thought leadership or in proactive thinking? Go ahead and talk a bit to that.
Well, what I've been able to do is because I realize that myself right now, I'm not yet able to be in public office, so I left it for other people. So my help in terms of communications is I like to work with clients that I am aligned in terms of values, because it's so easy for politicians to get up on a podium and start speaking in the opposite direction. So in terms of I truly am guided by my values. So if I feel like we have misaligned values, as an act of self-preservation, I step back. It might be a naive way to look at or practice leadership in my context, but I sleep easy at night based on that.
Amen. All right, Marius, your words, your thoughts.
Thank you, Jay. I was just listening to Trish there, to Linda there, and reflecting that leadership does require courage. In some of these challenges that we're trying to address, they aren't singular changes that one can attack directly. And this is, what I'm sharing an unfinished thought, but I think it's something about the intersection between patience, strategic agility, and courage. Linda talks about the convictions around her values, but along with those, one does need to, with this kind of change that leadership tries to bring about, one does need to have a long-term view and sometimes accept that the work you're doing will not have a direct impact, but may have a second order or third order impact. I'm reminded of a wonderful conversation I was part of with a group of activists, in fact, in Zimbabwe, in Harare, about 2 weeks before the change in previous leadership, let me call it that, where these were young activists working in civil society, interested in understanding their potential role in enabling leadership change, but enabling better leadership. And I think that those kinds of conversations, sometimes the direct impacts aren't visible, but the long-term impact can be. I was very fortunate on the day that the country went through a leadership change to see media footage of one of those young activists waving a Zimbabwean flag, standing on a tank outside the presidential residence. And that was a wonderful confirmation that sometimes leadership emerges rather than being undertaken directly. And so something about courage.
Thank you so much. Well, folks, we're going to continue the conversation here, take a little interlude, but I want to thank the panelists, and we're going to bring you right back. But at this point, I want to bring up or share a screen and bring up a colleague. I got to grab a screen here. And if you haven't asked a question if you haven't asked a question in Q&A, go ahead and ask a question. If you have a comment to bring, Trisha's monitoring both. Bring a comment now. But I want to bring up Dr. Denny Roberts. Dr. Roberts is a senior scholar. He's a student affairs professional. He's instrumental in shaping ILA's general principles. Denny, come up and share with us your response to what you hear in the panel as our participants post in chat and Q&A.
Thank you, Jay. What an extraordinary opportunity to listen to Linda and Emnet and Marius today. And this is more than we could have hoped for. I'm representing the Committee on the Advancement of Leadership Programs, and Jay explained earlier in his introduction what that group is and their work with the ILA general principles. And this webinar basically was inspired by a realization that the world, in fact, has changed very dramatically since the general principles were first drafted. As authors of that document and advocates of that document, we have a responsibility to be humble, in terms of what we don't know. Linda articulated that very, very clearly. This all needs to start with what do we don't know and what do we need to learn. And that's why we asked for this panel to be put together, was for us to listen more deeply to people who have had grounded experience in trying to make a difference in leadership in very different cultural and political and social contexts. So I'm thrilled the comments that have been made, and I pray that those of you that are participating today will go back into the member groups of ILA, you'll go back through your networks, and that you will advocate these big issues. It's very important that we all exercise our scholarship and our cultivation of leadership, but sometimes we lose the grander sight of really what's our purpose. And we're trying to make a difference. We're trying to make leadership more constructive and more purposeful for a shared future. So thank you for our panelists, and I hope those of you that are participating will help us improve the general principles and get the word out there that these are available. They are helpful to get us to think about big issues. Thank you, Jay.
All right. Thank you, Denny. So, Tricia, we're turning the program over to you now. Take down the slides, give us a Q&A for 20 minutes, and we look forward to our panelists further enriching us. And if you haven't brought comments, bring them in comments or particularly in Q&A, and we'll respond to that way. So, Tricia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, and thanks to the panelists. So we've got a few questions. The first is from a South African scholar. The question is, can African leadership offer, or what can African leadership models or frameworks offer to the Global South, as opposed to the current Western leadership paradigms that have been discussed or offered? Dr. Emnen, I think the pressure's on you.
No, it's a pleasure. Actually, that is a conversation that we are having here in South Africa. What are the roles of paradigms from the Global South that can actually contribute to the leadership role that we are having in the rest of part of the world? Of course, there are a lot of leadership styles and leadership models, leadership practices that can be taken as an example or a place to learn from different institutions and African governments. But again, these practices are not really properly documented and properly studied and they are scattered in different places. And of course, that is why it is always difficult to bring them out and use and also convince authorities to, take them into account when it comes to reformulating or restructuring leadership platforms or leadership styles in Africa and beyond. But there are a number of different leadership styles and principles and paradigms, not only in Africa, but generally in the global South, that can be useful for dealing with some of really serious challenges that we are facing at the moment.
You're muted, Trish.
I've remuted myself. Would other panelists like to respond to that question? Non-Western frames, African frames for leadership.
Trish, maybe I can chime in there. I left a little comment in the chat as well. And this is something I've been looking at recently, so I'm happy to share. I think a key insight for me is that very often Western leadership paradigms are dominated by what some would refer to as instrumental rationality and individualism. So very much focused on function, very much focused on the capabilities of the individual. What we do see in African traditional culture, which I think can offer something to leadership, is a communal perspective of belonging or relationality. There are, of course, leadership theories that touch on leadership-follower relationships, servant leadership, transformational leadership. But I think there's a deeper principle here about leading from a place of belonging. How do we lead when those we are leading are our family, our community? And I think that that's something that certainly Africa has perspectives on, as I've shared in the chat.
Now you're going to get us in trouble. We'll start talking about some feminist approaches to leadership, and then we'll end up in real hot water here. Okay, we don't want to end up there. It's too early here in the U.S. to get in that much hot water with the ILA. Okay, so we've also got some good information in the chat here, and Denny pointed us to it. So let's get into one of the questions we've got here is about discussions regarding the U.S.'s role pre-retrenchment or reset. So the question is that there are multilateral institutions and formats that have not always been very positive to the global South. And in many cases, the retrenchment is a desired reset for the global South, or the NGO industries set aside. So would you talk a little bit about that reset or retrenchment from that lens? Are there benefits to it for the global South, and what is that looking like?
I think that's a very interesting remark and also question, because if you think about the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organizations, which were highly advocated and even supported and promoted by the US for how many years now, they have not been as effective as we hoped in the global South. And some of the impact they created, especially during the 1980s and late 1970s through structural adjustment programs, the impact is still being felt in many countries, including Africa. So there is a considerable degree of kind of resistance toward this, the involvement of these institutions or the role of these institutions in developing countries. They are not totally, they don't have totally a romantic picture in the global South. So the critical approach now the US is taking towards the World Health Organization or other international organizations also open up the door for critical conversation, from all groups, not only from the global South, but also other countries in the global North, including Europe. So I think it creates some sort of unease in different parts of the world, but also open up the floor for more dialogue, more conversation, to critically interrogate whether these institutions really are doing what they are intended to do, or is there any room for improvement, or is there totally a bad idea to refrain from them, or to be totally involved in them. So these kind of conversations are really important, and I think I agree with that question and a remark also.
Linda, would you be interested in adding to that at all from the perspective of this balance of the reset and the retrenchment, and what the opportunity is from the context of the African continent's perspective? You don't have to give the continental perspective, the Zimbabwean perspective.
Right. I think that from a citizen, let me speak as a citizen, from a citizenry point of view, this will give a chance for our leaders to actually rise and prove themselves to be good leaders. In my context, we've had excuses that, oh, the US meddles in our affairs, we are under sanctions, etc., etc. But now that they've pulled aid, of which most of us did not know that the US was still funding certain government line items in terms of health. So now it gives a chance for our leaders to prove that they're good leaders, and maybe put a little bit of pressure on us citizens to elect better. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about this pressure that this move from the US does place on global authority, global leadership, whether you're elected or an appointed official. So one of the questions that's been placed here is about leadership in Africa and what the challenges are. So when you think about those elected leaders and think about your country's contexts, what are the challenges for them to get involved, in particular with these current government leaders, and to develop some strategies that are future focused to implement some global approaches to respond to this current moment in global leadership?
Trish, if I may respond there, I think we are facing, and before I come down to the level of African leaders, as you've asked it, I would add to the previous set of comments that we are facing two conundrums at the global multilateral level. The one is around formal reform. So at the center of these global institutions, for instance, is the Security Council and the General Assembly. But if you look at who runs it, how they contribute, and who is in charge or who is present, it's very often the case that it's really the great powers centered around the US, Russia, China, etc., that have the lion's share of the influence, the time, the power to shape those institutions. And so for Africa and other global South leaders to play a role, we have to be honest and say these formal institutions need structural and other forms of reform. And there is a positive discourse in that direction. It's very often hamstrung by the national interests of the great powers that will allow reform to the extent that it benefits them, but it is an agenda that needs to be driven. And then the second conundrum is that African leaders, for instance, can only lead on the global stage to the extent that they have the credibility and the platform to do so. And so this comes to the heart of your question. What do African leaders need? Well, in many respects, they need to get their own house in order around good governance, state effectiveness. And this goes to the core of leadership capabilities, like the ability to lead large, complex institutions, the ability to make pragmatic decisions in the face of political contestation. And so there's an incredible amount of work to do for Africa to build the leadership ability, to develop the institutional capacity to get its own development trajectory right. And to the extent that Africa succeeds at that, it will gain the credibility and the platform, I believe, to participate more fully at the global multilateral level.
You're getting some shout outs in the chat that was brilliantly stated. So well done. What would others like to add to that?
I think maybe if I would say, and then the other challenge that could be probably discussed or put out here is that most of the leadership in many African countries follows a top-down approach, and instead of a bottom-up approach, consulting the public and the society at large. So it's very difficult to really see the agency of the public in decision-making processes, and most of leaders actually do make grand decisions that may not necessarily represent their constituency because of lack of appropriate democratic process to put them in power or remove them from power. So that is a big challenge in many African countries. I can't generalize in all. And this also reflects when they deal with other global leaders and whether they are representing the interest of their people, or they are representing the interest of only their parties or their individual interest. And this has always been part of the conversation. So the type of leadership that we see in many African countries may not necessarily be reflective of the interest of the public at large, and which has significantly affect the way how leaders and governments deal with the rest part of the world.
Thank you. So we've got a layering in and of the models of African leadership that are worth forwarding, and also the realities of the governance structures which have the top-down modeling that has to be contended with. We've got an additional question in here, which is about America's current regime. So with America's current regime moving from principled leadership to transactional leadership and abandonment from basic constitutional values like rule of law, one person, one vote, due process, and checks and balances, what kind of leadership is required from the many in response to this takeover by the few?
Trish, I have a comment for you, but I thought I might ask Linda if she wanted to add something first. So, Trish, I guess from my perspective, the challenge that the US is facing, and this, of course, is an outsider perspective, is really not as simple as an individual in the form of the current president moving from principle to transaction. There is, it's very apparent that there is a societal, socioeconomic underbelly to the discontent that has brought President Trump to the White House for a second time. And so when we look at why he's in leadership and what are the roots of his legitimacy, to the extent that he has legitimacy, having been voted for, that seems to me to be rooted in forms of discontent around the exclusion of certain segments of society, the structure of the US economy, and to the extent that certain segments can participate in that economy and benefit from that economy, trust around institutions and those who lead them, the famous reference to the swamp being drained, etc. And so I guess my thought would be that the many need to do the real work of understanding what has gone wrong at the societal level. What is it that in the social contract of a US citizen and their relationship to one another and their community that needs to be addressed? Of course, political parties have their manifestos and their policy platforms, but I think at the heart there's something that is not about being Democratic or Republican or left or right, but is around building a more sound US society and a more appropriate role for the US in the wider world. And I believe that to the extent that ordinary citizens have good answers to those tough questions, they'll find again the moral voice and the principled voice to stand for the things that have made America so wonderful. Rule of law, free markets, civic freedoms that I think are still cherished, but are being set aside in favor of more short-term, narrow interests because of the current environment.
Sounds like a damning challenge to Americans to re-examine our own moral compasses and values. Thank you for that. Mnet, Linda, anything you'd add to that?
I think Maurice summarized it in a very well-articulated way. But just to add maybe one point, I think the role of civil society here is very important in terms of probably consolidating those public interests and make a little bit of resistance to what is actually happening. Because expecting something from structured government agencies in this context would be very challenging. So I think the role of civil societies and think tanks, individuals, pushing the agenda and making sure that principles really matters in addition to norms and in addition to other interests. It's to push this agenda is quite important, and I think the role of civil society organization in advocating and making the voices heard is, I think it's quite important in this context.
I would just like to add that the few deserve to be heard by the many. Conversations need to happen. And in as much as the heat has been raised in the US right now, it could, if honest conversations are heard and the views of the many, even though uncomfortable, those voices are heard, I think an America that is beneficial to all could emerge from all of this. But the few voices do deserve to be heard by the many. That's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one final question for the panel, and then I'll turn it back over to Jay. And the final panel question, and we'll start with Linda and then go back around, is: does good leadership translate to good strategy? And which, in your opinion, do you need most?
That's a very good question. I would say that good leadership is anchored on good governance, and good governance should be anchored on good strategy. Without a good strategy, you really cannot effect good governance, and therefore can't be a good leader. I don't think you can separate the two. You need both.
Mnet?
I think my comment are quite covered by Linda. I would say you can't really think of a good leadership without good governance, and then also having a clear strategy, because these things are quite interrelated and they need equal attention and equal interrogation also. And this is what we have seen or witnessed when we look into the different leadership styles of states and governments in the past. So I think it's I agree, entirely agree with what Linda said.
And last but certainly not least, the good doctor.
Thank you, Trish. In fact, I was reminded by your question, Trish, of a study I did some time ago on the conceptual relationship between leadership, strategy, and ethics. And I think at the core, strategy is about option generation. It's about means and ends. And so strategy inevitably requires you to make trade-offs. You exercise options at a cost. Whereas ethics is about calculating the ends and whether the means justify those ends. And so or the ends, is justified by the means. And so I think as leaders, we need to do strategy, but we also need to calculate the cost or count the cost of the strategies we execute. Leadership is essentially about moving individuals or organizations or systems towards particular ends. And so I think these three things are nested. One can have a leader without a strategy. One can have good ethics without a strategy. But I think the best is when we have a clear strategy with an understanding of the ethical implications of it, and then the leadership to move our constituencies towards that.
Thank you. And thank you all three for your time. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. J. Yep, Dr. J, you are muted.
All right. Thank you, panelists. We've had a fantastic conversation, and maybe we can turn to Winston Churchill and cross our fingers and pray that America can always be trusted to the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted, and perhaps in partnership with the Global South and other allies and across the world. Thank you, panelists. Wonderful. So let me just wrap this up in the next 2 minutes of upcoming events. Turn to ILA for extraordinary books, podcasts, and webinars. If you haven't joined as a member, do so today. And they're the leading community worldwide for the study and practice of leadership. I'm enriched every time I associate with ILA. Those of you that are interested in artificial intelligence, we had a virtual summit back in January, and those sessions are now available for $50. You can listen to them and participate in 17, 18 sessions. So go ahead and purchase that. Also, in Claremont, California, June 11th, we have a Women in Leadership Conference. Embrace and elevate systems of change. So transformative thinking on women in leadership. It's not too late to register if you're again. Now, those of you who are leadership educators, your faculty, your training, you want to understand leadership studies. We're gathering in College Park, Maryland, July 28th. For multi-day training. So if you write curriculum, if you train, if you develop programs, this is a premier event. The registration's limited. You're right under 100 people, I think. So go ahead and get your registration in then. And then the premier event of the year is coming up, ILA Global Conference. There's call for papers, but particularly, more importantly, you can register by mid-July, July 14th, and save $100. So this is an extraordinary event. Every year, ILA holds a global conference. This year, it's in Prague, Czech Republic. So join us there. I want to thank all of us and those of you attended, our panelists particularly, a fantastic conversation, and also a shout out to Dr. Tricia Gott for Kansas State University for a wonderful moderation with our panelists. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you together. Bye-bye.